42-year-old Jesse Javier Carlos was a former tax specialist with the Department of Finance. He and his wife, his high school sweetheart Jen, lived on 1663 Felix Huerta Street with their 3 children. The Carlos family were described as pleasant, polite. Their children were well-mannered and well-behaved, and Jesse and Jen were a quiet couple that kept to themselves. Jesse Carlos had come from very little. His mother, Theodora, used to make and sell baked goods on her knees for hours just to send her children to school. When Jesse was a young boy, his family spent several years fighting eviction notices. As he got older, he started working odd jobs until he decided to study custom brokerage. His cousin said that although Jesse wasn't the sort of person to get awards in school, he was determined to do well, and before long, Jesse Carlos found himself working the Department of Finance. Between the years of 2000 and 2010, his wealth had seemingly grown by a substantial amount. The family had a personal driver that drove the children to private schools each day, and a rotating series of nice cars were parked outside the home. As well as presents every Christmas, Jesse would give envelopes lined with 1,000 pesos for each of his relatives. However, no one in the neighborhood really knew how Jesse Carlos made his money. Carlos would eventually find himself let go from the Department of Finance for misdeclaring his statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth. At the time of his employment, he was making around 15,000 pesos a month, but had declared assets of more than 9 million pesos. In 2012, the Office of the Ombudsman found him unable to reasonably explain the huge disparity between his income and his properties. Following this, he was dismissed in 2014. His retirement benefits were forfeited as a result, and he was disqualified for any post in government service. This is when people in the neighborhood said everything started to change for the Carlos family. The cars slowly started disappearing, the private drivers stopped receiving calls to come to work, and it was rumored that Jesse and Jen wanted to sell their house. It was no secret that Jesse Carlos was a gambling addict. He was a high roller, usually placing a minimum bet of 40,000 pesos. He had been banned from several casinos at the request of his family, and this had also led to his wife Jen eventually separating from him. Jesse Carlos was around 4 million pesos in debt with the banks alone. He was continuing to sell various assets to fund his ever-growing gambling habits. One of his neighbors, Cecilia, had a son that grew up with Jesse. She said Jesse began gambling and betting early on, playing caracris in the street with the boys, and later started cockfighting, betting vast amounts of money on this too. On June 1st, Jesse Carlos attended a hearing that involved the government's attempts to seize 6 million pesos worth of his assets. He tried to settle the case for 1,200,000, but the government rejected the offer. At around 4 p.m. on June 1st, 3 men entered Resorts World Manila: Elma Mitra Jr., Elvin Cruzan, and also Jesse Javier Carlos. They stayed for a couple of hours and had coffee at the Maxim Hotel before leaving and getting into a gray BMW. As the evening rolled around and the nightlife of Resorts World Manila kicked in, Alma Mitra Jr., Alvin Cruzan, and Jesse Javier Carlos were still driving around talking. Alma Mitra Jr. worked at the Philippine National Construction Corporation and was also a lawyer. Alvin Cruzan was a retired police officer and was now working as a casino financier. The conversations that took place in the car that night can never be known, but people speculated that Jesse Carlos may have been getting pressured by Elmer and Alvin to repay his debts. Just before 10 p.m., Carlos pulled a gun out and shot Elmer. Witnesses described hearing more gunshots from inside the car before the car crashed and overturned. Carlos crawled out from the back seat and stumbled off into the night. When police arrived on scene, they recovered 4 9mm casings, 6 bullets, and a 9mm pistol in the car. Both Elmer and Alvin were dead from gunshot wounds to the heads. As officers were dealing with the crash and shooting, just before 11 p.m., Jesse Carlos returned home. He changed his clothes and left his house again, heading for the casino in Resorts World Manila. At 11:19, he stopped at a local refueling station where he bought 3 liters of gasoline. At 12:07 a.m., Carlos arrived at the entertainment complex by taxi. He was wearing plain black clothes and carrying a large bag. He exited the taxi, limping slightly as he did so. Unbeknownst to anyone around, Inside his bag was a rifle and the container of gasoline. He got in an elevator with two women and headed to the parking areas, getting out on the second floor. As he left the elevator, he put on a mask and an ammunition vest, promptly walked into the casino, avoiding the metal detectors and the security guard, took out his rifle and started shooting. Everyone started running for their lives. Security did their best to contain the situation and started trying to evacuate more than 12,000 people from the complex. But the fear and panic proved too much. Stampedes of people crammed into the exits, with some even jumping out of windows. Many people crowded into various cupboards and rooms around the casino, barricading themselves in. At this time, it was unclear how many shooters there were because of the amount of shots that were being fired. Some guests recalled hearing the word terrorist being shouted throughout the building, causing even more panic and uncertainty. In one of the rooms, Carlos took out the gasoline, poured it over one of the gambling tables, and set it alight before throwing his bag containing the ammunition into the flames. He continued moving around the area, setting it on fire as he went. Carlos then entered one of the rooms containing the safes. He shot at the locks on the door before gaining entry to the room with the casino chips in. He spent some time stuffing casino chips into a bag. These chips totaled at just over 113 million pesos, which was the equivalent of just over $2 million at the time. At 1:30 a.m., the building's security and armed police were inside the resort looking for the shooter or shooters, as it remained unclear how many perpetrators there were. Fear was spreading rapidly, and it wasn't long before the main gates of the 4 terminals at the airport shut, and only passengers and airport personnel already inside were able to move around. Carlos was now wandering around slowly and aimlessly, seemingly unclear as to where to go and what to do next. Suddenly, a security personnel looked behind the door and saw Carlos. He quickly backed off before attempting to shoot him. They both fired at each other for a few seconds, and Carlos was hit in the process. He then shut the door and slowly headed up the stairs. He entered the Maxim Hotel in the resort, shooting as he went. At 1:46 a.m., he shot into room number 510. He grabbed some towels and set them on fire outside in the hallway before entering the room himself. Before long, police and security cautiously entered the hallway before approaching room 510. Inside the room on the bed was the body of Jesse Javier Carlos. He had covered himself with a thick blanket before setting himself on fire and shooting himself in the head. He was burned beyond any recognition. People were gathered outside of the burning building waiting for news of their loved ones who were trapped inside. It was a truly terrifying and heart-wrenching ordeal for the community. It was confirmed that nobody died from a gunshot aside from Carlos himself, but the fires he had set had spread quickly, and tragically, many people had suffocated to death inside the building. A few people also died when a ceiling collapsed on them. A further 70 people were left injured due to the stampedes when leaving the building. Police speculate that when Carlos threw his bag of ammunition onto the burning casino table, this only added to the idea that there was more than one shooter in the building and amplified people's fears about leaving the rooms they had barricaded themselves into. And tragically, this meant they had suffocated to death as a result. All the initial suspicions pointed towards an act of terror, with affiliates of Daesh, known more commonly as ISIS, claiming responsibility for the attack. But representatives of the Philippine National Police consistently maintained that the motive was likely a robbery. The shooter was working alone, and it was not a terrorist attack. Steve Cutler, chairman of the Overseas Security Advisory Council, also agreed the incident was a robbery and not an act of terrorism. However, the Speaker of the Philippine House of Representatives disagreed with the police and hinted at the possibility of it being a lone wolf terrorist attack. Soon after the incident, Philippine National Police General Ronald De La Rosa issued a statement in which he described the attack as being perpetrated by a single shooter. Any prior eyewitnesses' statements that believed there was more than one person involved. Rumors and speculation were still running rife, and the shooter's identity was still unknown to the police and public. But an autopsy was carried out, as well as using samples of blood that had been left around the casino. And with this, Jesse Javier Carlos' identity was finally revealed. Later that month, the The senior inspector of the Manila Police District Homicide Division also confirmed that Carlos was the only person of interest in the shooting of Alma Mitra Jr. and Alvin Cruzan. This followed forensic testing that was done on the car. Clothing found around Carlos' house also matched the clothes he was seen wearing after the crash in various bits of CCTV footage. On June 7th, the House of Representatives Committee on Public Order and Safety and the Committee on Games and Amusement started an investigation into the tragic events. The management of Resorts World Manila admitted there was a lapse in security on that day, and the casino's CEO said upon reviewing the CCTV footage, they realized that some security personnel were not in their assigned areas when Carlos entered the casino. Philippine Amusements and Gaming Corporation, also known as PADCorp, regulates casinos and issues the licenses and authority for casinos to operate. On June 9th, they suspended Armin Gomez, the head of security for Resorts World Manila. Armin Gomez, the head of security for Resorts World Manila, saw his credentials severely scrutinized. It came to light that he only had a short stint in training, despite him previously stating he had 10 years of experience as a security practitioner. The House Majority Leader, Rodolfo Farengas, said that the casino's personnel should have been adequately trained. At the time of the attack, Gomez was already on his way home. It came to light that management of the resort were given a heads up to boost their security a matter of days before the attack happened. But for some reason, this wasn't followed up on. Senators urged establishments, particularly tourism facilities, to tighten up on security. And in response to the attack, police also increased their presence in shopping centers in Metro Manila. The chief operating officer of Resorts World Manila said the company was going to give 1 million pesos to each of the families of those who died in the attack. The license suspension that had been imposed by PADCor was lifted on June 29th, and Resorts World Manila resumed its gambling operations. The casino also hired a private security consultant to tighten up their security procedures. It's been reported that the gambling area on the second floor that was affected by the attack will be converted to be part of the shopping mall. Although robbery seemed like the only motive, the true reasoning behind Jesse Carlos' actions that night can never be fully known. Jesse's cousin has his own theory. He wonders if maybe, even though Jesse knew he couldn't cash the chips in, he took them anyway so that he could feel, even if just for a moment, that he had won back what he once lost. The chaos and devastation caused early that morning was widespread and felt by everyone. Although Resorts World Manila is back seemingly in full swing, the events that transpired that day have had a lasting impact, and the community will likely continue to feel the weight and impact of what happened for many years to come. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. 40-year-old Rosalie Gutierrez Jr. is a resident of Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he has lived for the majority of his life. He is the loving father of two. He has an outgoing personality, lots of friends, and a love for the outdoors. On Sunday, May 17, 2020, he dropped off his daughter in Twin Lakes, a town 25 miles west of Kenosha. He spent every other weekend with his children. This would be the last confirmed sighting of him. He spoke on the phone to someone around 8:30 that night and has not been heard from since. Rosello worked for a contractor in Lake County, Illinois. He failed to report to work on May 18th, 19th, which was out of character for him. Rosello was also dating a woman who became concerned when she could not reach him. She therefore went to his apartment in the 37100 block of 15th Street to check on him. When she arrived, the sliding glass patio door was open. The furniture inside of the apartment was out of place, as though there had been an altercation, and a large area rug was missing. There was also a large amount of fresh blood on the floor and on some of the pieces of furniture. She immediately called the police. Rosalio's vehicles were parked outside of his apartment, and his cell phone had been left behind. Upon hearing of the disappearance, Rosalio's mother and stepfather, Celia and Eugene Patterson, immediately began the drive to Wisconsin from their home in Colorado to help search for him. "I want people to know he is missing and that he is loved and that we want him home," Celia told Fox 6 News. "I could not have asked for a better son." Authorities quickly had a suspect in Rosalia's disappearance. On May 21st, 2 days after Rosalia was reported missing, 39-year-old Zachariah Anderson of Mequon, Wisconsin was charged with 2 felonies for stalking his ex-girlfriend, who was also the mother of his children, and her current boyfriend. That woman's name has not been released because of the stalking case, but her boyfriend is Rosalio Gutierrez. In the criminal complaint against Anderson, the woman claims that he was aware of her relationship with Rosalio and did not approve of it. She believed that he had been tracking her movements, following her, and recording her without her knowledge based on places she saw him and information he had about her movements and conversations. When police interviewed Anderson's daughter, she told them that she had seen items that had been stolen from Rosalio's car while it was parked outside of her mother's home, including a letter and his car registration in her father's possession. He had also given her a phone and instructed her to use it to record her mother. Examination of that phone revealed that it had been used to order tracker devices from Amazon on April 21st. The girl also said that Anderson admitted to her that he had been videotaping her mother and Rosalio. Anderson denies these charges, and his defense attorney told the court that his former girlfriend had previously made false allegations against him. She had successfully petitioned for a restraining order against him in the past. Anderson told detectives that he was jealous of his former girlfriend's relationship with Rosalillo, but denied tracking her movements, recording her, or stealing from Rosalillo. He claimed his daughter had simply lied to the police. There is an ongoing investigation in which Mr. Anderson is the focus involving the whereabouts of Mr. Gutierrez. Deputy District Attorney Angelina Gabriel said of Anderson's first court appearance on the stalking charges. Even if Anderson is involved in Rosalia's disappearance, Celia Patterson believes there may still be another unknown individual who played a role in the case. Because of Rosalia's size and strength, Celia thinks that at least 2 people would have been needed to abduct him. She is also concerned that the weather may have negatively impacted the investigation. The sound of the heavy rains that fell on the night of the May 17th have prevented Rosalio's neighbors from hearing the fight in his apartment, and fewer people would have been outside to witness him being taken from his home. The Kenosha Police Department has released statements in the weeks following Rosalia's suspicious disappearance, assuring the public that they are still focused on the case, but they so far have not been able to release further information. Rosalia Gutierrez remains missing. On May 4, 2020, 28-year-old Devonte Morgan and his girlfriend traveled from the Bay Area to Mount Shasta, California. They would be staying at the Cold Creek Inn during their time there. The trip did not go as planned, however. The night they arrived in Mount Shasta, the couple got into a fight and ended the relationship. They still spent the night in the same room, but Devonte's now ex-girlfriend went out on her own the following morning to watch the sunrise. As she was walking back to the inn after watching the sunrise at approximately 9 a.m., she passed Devonte, who was walking south on Mount Shasta Boulevard. He still looked upset over their argument from the night before, so she did not try to speak with him and returned to the inn. Devonte, however, never came back to their room. On May 7th at 9:15 a.m., with no further sign of or word from Devonte, she went to the Mount Shasta Police Department to report him missing. The police were able to confirm Devonte's ex-girlfriend's stating of him on the morning of May 5th using surveillance footage, which showed Devonte walking south on Mount Shasta Boulevard just after 9 a.m. They were eventually able to find footage of Devonte on 10 different cameras at 6 different locations in Mount Shasta between 9 and 10 a.m. that morning. After 10 a.m., however, they have no idea where he went. Devonte's phone was last pinged on May 3rd, the day before he left on his trip to Mount Shasta. The phone has either been turned off or its battery has died and it cannot be traced. It is believed that Devonte had his debit card with him on the trip, but it has not been used since May 4th. There have been few leads in the case, but authorities have been doing what they can with the limited information they have. They received a tip that they did not believe was credible, but still brought in a cadaver dog to perform an area search based off of it. The effort did not locate Devonte. There have been some reported sightings of Devonte both in California and in Oregon. Mount Shasta police have followed up on them, but none of the individuals reported to police have turned out to be Devonte. I really don't have any theories. Nothing that's got any validity or credibility that is supported by evidence. Parrish Cross, the Mount Shasta police chief, said 2 weeks after Devontae's disappearance. Devontae's family traveled to Mount Shasta after he went missing to help with the search. They have covered a massive area on foot and by car searching for Devontae in town, in area campgrounds, and up in the mountains. They have not heard from him since he disappeared and say that he would not have voluntarily taken off without contacting them. They also say that Devontae was not familiar with the Mount Shasta area and had never been there before. In general, Devontae preferred to stay close to his home and to his family. They have enlisted the help of a private investigator to look for Devontae and are offering a $25,000 reward in the case. 79-year-old Joe Roy McMillan lives in Carthage, Texas, the county seat of Panola County. According to 20 on May 21, 2020, Joe left home to run some errands. The last place he is known to have been is Ted's Saw Shop on FM 1970 near Clayton. The store and its parking lot have surveillance cameras, so Joe's entire visit to the property is documented. The footage confirms that Joe was alone at the time. Joe drove away in his blue 2004 GMC Sierra at 3:09 p.m., but did not return home. Joe's disappearance is made all the more serious by his medical conditions. He is diabetic and was without his medication when he went missing. His family also says that Joe has begun showing some early symptoms of dementia. A large number of volunteers coordinated with law enforcement to search the wooded areas and small side roads in rural areas around Carthage for Joe and his truck. The search effort was made slightly easier by the bright blue color of Joe's truck and the fact that Joe was wearing a red polo shirt at the time of his disappearance, meaning that both Joe and the vehicle would not necessarily blend into their surroundings if they ended up in a remote area. Both law enforcement and Joe's family were able to locate surveillance footage of Joe's truck driving south from different cameras, mainly at gas stations. Not all of the footage shows who was driving the vehicle, but Joe can be seen in some of it. Some of the footage is from the Nacogdoches area and the last of it is from Livingston, over 100 miles south of Carthage. Joe had family in the Houston area, and it is believed he may have been driving to see them. Most of the footage of Joe's truck shows it traveling south on Route 59. Authorities are asking that anyone with a home or business with surveillance cameras along Route 59 check their footage for any side of the blue GMC Sierra with Texas license plate DMK 2975. The search for Joe is currently focusing on the Livingston area with hopes of finding either Joe or clues as to the route he took after he drove through the area. Joe's family is offering up to $5,000 as a reward for information that helps locate him. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 19-year-old Faith Hedgepeth was a UNC Chapel Hill sophomore. On the night of September 6, 2012, Faith spent several hours at the library and then a bar called The Thrill, a once popular venue with students that has since gone out of business. She went with her roommate, Karina Rosario, known to many as Rosie. After a while dancing, Karina said she felt sick, and the pair were seen on CCTV leaving the club just after 2 a.m. They drove back to their off-campus apartment together in Faith's car. Faith and Karina both lived at Hawthorne at the View and shared a second-floor apartment. The complex is surrounded by trees and has only one way in and one way out. By 3 a.m., the pair were back at their apartment. A neighbor who was up late watching TV said she heard noises coming from the apartment which belonged to the girls. She said she'd heard thumping noises which sounded like a very heavy book bag being dropped or an end table being turned over. Around this time, records show that Faith's Facebook was accessed. At 3:40 a.m., a text was sent from Faith's phone to a man named Brandon Edwards. Ty Michael McNeil, Faith's college boyfriend, also received a text at 3:52 a.m. Karina left the apartment at 4:27 a.m., getting picked up by a friend named Jordan and leaving the apartment door unlocked. She said Faith was asleep in bed at the time. Karina stayed at her friend's apartment for the remainder of the morning before calling Faith for a lift home at about 10:30 a.m. Faith never answered the phone. Karina then phoned another friend named Marisol. Marisol picked Karina up, and they both drove back to Karina and Faith's apartment. Getting there for approximately 11 a.m., Faith's body was discovered near her bed, and the crime scene was brutal. An autopsy revealed she had died from severe blows and blunt force trauma to her head. Faith was positioned on the floor leaning against the bed with her shirt pulled up over her face, and she had no clothes on from the waist down. She was also partly covered with a blanket. Investigators found semen on Faith's body, which matched male DNA found elsewhere in the apartment. Police said at the time it was more likely than not that Faith had been raped. Next to Faith's body was a handwritten note that read, "I'm not stupid, bitch, jealous." And it was written on the back of a takeout bag. Karina phoned 911, and police arrived at the apartment. Many people were questioned and considered persons of interest, including Karina's ex-boyfriend, Eric Takoi Jones, and Faith's college boyfriend, Ty Michael McNeil. DNA samples were compared, but no one came back as a match to the crime scene. No witnesses apart from the neighbor that heard thumping sounds came forward and said they had seen anything or anyone in or around the apartment at that time. And sadly, there was no CCTV. The DNA from 52 pieces of evidence, including the murder weapon, thought to be a Bacardi rum bottle, were cross-referenced with 100 of different DNA samples to rule out suspects. In 2016, from the DNA found at the scene, a composite sketch was put together using genetic coding from the DNA, which acted like a blueprint. Experts released this image of who they believed could possibly be the killer. They said it didn't rule anyone else out as being potentially involved, but the DNA indicated that the suspect is very strongly of Native American and European mixed ancestry or Latino. Several more years would pass with no leads on Faith's case. This takes us to September 16, 2021. 28-year-old Miguel Enrique Salguero Oliveras was arrested. He has a Chapel Hill address listed and was also charged with no operator's license, no liability insurance, an open container alcohol violation, and a registration violation according to court records. He failed to appear in court on September 3rd, and an outstanding order for his arrest was issued on September 7th, the court documents also showed. Police have since announced that his DNA was a match to the crime scene of Faith's apartment, and he has now been charged with first-degree murder in the case of Faith Daniel Hedgepeth. He would have been 19 at the time of the alleged offense, and he was not initially a suspect or person of interest at the beginning of the investigation. There have been few details given about the accused and how or if he had known Faith, and authorities have yet to comment on whether he will also be charged with a sex crime too. He is currently being held without bond at the Durham County Jail. Anna Mary Barnett of Radcliffe, Kentucky was just a teenager when she became a mother. As much as she loved her son Jerry, she struggled to support him. In order to be able to provide for him, she generally relied on family members to look after her son while she was at work. One day in 1965, however, Anna Mary could not find a relative to watch 5-year-old Cherry. She therefore had to leave him with a babysitter while she was at work. She did not know the babysitter, who lived in nearby Elizabethtown, very well, but she did not have any other childcare option that day. However, when Anna Mary returned to pick up her son, both Jerry and the babysitter were gone. Neighbors of the babysitter told Anna Mary that she had simply packed up and left. Anna Mary and her family tried to get assistance from local law enforcement agencies but were turned away. The only reasons they could think of for their refusal to investigate the case were Anna Mary's race or age. Whatever the authorities' reasons were for not taking Jerry's disappearance seriously, Anna Mary was more scared after asking them for help than she was when she first went to see them. The babysitter took Jerry to Delaware, where she then abandoned him. Authorities there did not have any records on him, and he was too young to provide them with details about his family or where they lived. Jerry was given the last name of Thomas and an estimated birth date and placed into foster care. Jerry grew up and eventually had children of his own. However, by his own admission, he sometimes found it challenging to be active in their lives because of the trauma he had experienced in foster care and the way it negatively influenced his understanding of the concept family. It would be one of his children who would ultimately help reunite Jerry with his family and begin to heal that damage. In 2016, Jerry's son, Damon Parker, took a commercial DNA test. In early 2020, a new DNA match showed up in the system. That match was his cousin in Kentucky, Will Barnett. Will was able to explain to Damon the details of Jerry's background and the story of how he was taken from his family. Damon was then able to speak his grandmother, Anna Mary, and arrange a reunion. In February of 2020, Damon and Jerry made the 10-hour drive from Delaware to Radcliffe. Outside of his mother's home, Jerry was met by a large group of emotional family members. After 55 years, he was finally reunited with his mother. Anna Mary knew he was really her son as soon as she saw him and was beside herself with joy at finally having him back in her life. The entire family is grateful to have Jerry back and finally relieved of the stress and concern they have carried for so many years. Jerry says the reunion and the joy his family has shown over it has filled a void that he always felt during his time apart from them. Raymond Nelson was born on September 1, 1911 in Iowa and grew up in the city of Logan. He graduated from high school in 1931 and worked as a clerk at the Logan Canty Drug Store. In 1934, he married Helen Smith, and the couple would eventually have 2 daughters, Roberta and Claudia. On December 3, 1940, Raymond dropped off his laundry at his parents' home in Logan. His sister reported that he had tears in his eyes while he was there. This would be the last time anyone in his family would see him. His youngest daughter was just 4 months old at the time. Shortly after Raymond went missing, a truck driver named J.A. Peterson came forward. Peterson said that he had given Raymond a ride to Council Bluffs on the night of December 3rd. Raymond had told him that he was on his way to Omaha, where he was due to report to work at the airport the following morning. Police went to Omaha to look for Raymond there, but found no evidence that he had arrived in the city. They believed that this meant Raymond either had met with foul play or had traveled further west. The FBI became involved in Raymond's disappearance after his draft number was called up, and he did not report for duty. They could not locate him, and he was declared a draft dodger. Raymond's social security number was never used after he went missing. There were certain details that made it appear Raymond may have voluntarily disappeared. He stopped paying many of his bills, including the one for his life insurance, shortly before he went missing. However, some members of his family were still convinced that something terrible had happened to him. His mother, Millie, remained positive that her son was not the kind of man who would have walked out on his family until her dying day. Raymond's oldest daughter, Roberta, found more comfort in the idea that something eventually had a daughter of her own, Jennifer Hoffman, who would be the driving force behind finally solving Raymond's case. Jennifer grew up hearing stories about her lost grandfather, and after she became a private investigator, she began looking into the case with hopes of finally being able to tell her mother what really happened to Raymond. Jennifer, of course, used the basic investigative techniques, collecting documents and speaking to, in this case, her relatives. She tried more creative methods as well. Raymond loved model airplanes and was highly skilled at constructing them. Some of his planes were featured in window displays at the Brandeis department store in downtown Omaha. Jennifer therefore began researching the model airplane community in case Raymond did leave Iowa voluntarily and continued his hobby elsewhere. During this research, she came across an image of an Australian man named Monty Tyrrell. Monty was a prominent enough member of the model airplane community that the Monty Tyrrell Memorial Scale Rally, held by the Peckham and District Aircraft Radio Control Society, is still put on every March, almost 30 years after his death. Believed that there was a striking resemblance between Monty and her grandfather. She began trying to get in contact with individuals in Australia with information about Monty, but her early efforts were unsuccessful. She was eventually able to locate someone who had known Monty towards the end of his life. This person told her that Monty's father, Ned, had lived in South Australia and worked at the Tivoli Theatre in Adelaide. If this information was correct, it would mean that Monty was not really Raymond Nelson. However, Jennifer hired an Australian private investigator who learned that no one named Ned had worked at the Tivoli. Furthermore, he could not find any information about Monty for a 30-year period, which he found suspicious. By 2004, Monty Tyrrell was Jennifer's strongest theory, but she had no way to prove if he really had been her grandfather. The lack of resolution in the case would nag Jennifer for the next 16 years until she received a phone call that would finally close it. In the spring of 2020, a man named Mark Nelson was using Ancestry.com to research his family. When researching the life of his grandfather, Roy C. Nelson, he was unable to find any information about him from before 1940. It was as though Roy had not existed before that year. Roy's parents, Nels and Millie Nelson, were named in Roy's obituary, so Mark began researching them. He could find no mention of having a son or living with anyone named Roy, but he did find record of their son, Raymond Nelson of Iowa. Raymond Nelson had the exact same date of birth as Roy Nelson. Mark's grandfather had claimed to be from Hibbing, Minnesota, and never used the name Raymond. Mark was not immediately concerned by these details. Perhaps his grandfather had been born in Minnesota and lived in Iowa later and disliked his name, so he went by Roy instead. However, both Roy Nelson and Raymond Nelson had draft cards on file on Ancestry.com. Comparing the signatures on them, Mark noticed that the name Nelson had been signed almost identically. When Mark looked Raymond Nelson up online, he came across an article about his disappearance and Jennifer Huffman's quest to solve it. He got in contact with her and shared with her all of the information he had gathered. Jennifer agreed that the signatures on the draft cards appeared to have been signed by the same person, and photographs of Roy Nelson were strikingly similar to ones of Raymond. Further confirming that Roy really was Raymond was the DNA of Raymond's granddaughter Gina, whose mother was Raymond's daughter Roberta. When Gina used a commercial DNA site, it matched her with a close cousin in Connecticut. The Nelson family could not figure out how this person fit into their family tree at the time. After learning about Roy Nelson, however, they discovered that this relative was a member of his family. Raymond had left Iowa on his own and moved to Connecticut, where he applied for a new social security number and changed his name to Roy. While living as Roy, Raymond had 4 more children. Raymond's reasons for leaving his family in Iowa will remain unknown, but they at least now know what became of him. It's kind of bittersweet, his daughter Claudia told the Daily Nonpareil, but I'm glad we finally know what happened. Vanessa Smallwood of Maple Shade, New Jersey, was a devout Christian who was passionate about sharing her faith with others. She loved her family, especially her 3 grown sons. She had a kind heart and a caring spirit. At the beginning of 2014, the 46-year-old was going through a difficult period. She was unhappy with her marriage and on disability from her job as a contractor at the Philadelphia International Airport. She had become sick after dealing with the stress of her mother's death and her father suffering multiple strokes. She did have a history of mental health issues, but a cousin who saw her on January 25th would later report that Vanessa had been speaking optimistically about her future. On January 27, 2014, Vanessa and her husband drove to the Any Garment Cleaners in the 500 block of Haddonfield Road in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Vanessa's husband went inside while she waited for him outside in their 2005 Chrysler Town and Country minivan. When he came back out, however, Vanessa and the vehicle were gone. Vanessa's cell phone pinged near Broad Street in Clayton, New Jersey, approximately 25 miles south of where she was last seen, at 10:22 a.m. on the day she went missing. This would be the only indication of where she went after leaving the dry cleaners. There was no activity on her credit cards or bank accounts, and authorities could not locate her vehicle. On January 16, 2020, divers from the Walker Diving Underwater Construction Company were clearing debris from the Salem River near the Port of Salem to ensure that the river was safe for shipping. During this process, they came across a badly mangled Chrysler van submerged underwater. The van was pulled from the river around noon that day, and human remains were found inside of it. They were later confirmed to be Vanessa Smallwood. Vanessa's exact cause of death has not been revealed, but Salem County Prosecutor John Linehan did announce that the medical examiner found no indications of foul play in the case. 6 years after Vanessa went missing, her family was finally able to lay her to rest. Christmas Eve, 1991. Sue and Clive welcomed their daughter, Alice, into the world. Described by friends and family as a loving and empathetic person, outgoing, quick-witted, and fun, 24-year-old Alice Ruggles was adored by those in her life. People that knew her said she had the ability to cheer anyone up and was a natural entertainer. She was mischievous, funny, and loved socializing. Alice was from a close-knit family and was the third of 4 children. She and her siblings grew up in the quiet, rural Leicestershire village of Turlington. She attended Leicester High School for Girls and from there went on to Northumbria University to study product design. Alice discovered fencing at the age of 11, and the sport quickly became a big part of her life. She went on to represent her home county of Leicestershire and the East Midlands region numerous times. At Northumbria University, Alice became the fencing club captain and went on to win the Women's A-Pay at the Leeds Open in 2012. Alice fell in love with the city of Newcastle and carried on living there after she graduated. She got a job at Sky's Newcastle hub, and it wasn't long before her hardworking attitude paid off, and she was promoted to site coordinator. In October 2015, Alice started talking to Tremaine Dillon. Tremaine, known to everyone as Harry, was a lance corporal based at Glencorse Barracks in Edinburgh, Scotland, and was training to join the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. At the time he and Alice connected, he was serving in Afghanistan, and the pair started talking over Facebook. In January 2016, the couple met in person for the first time, and initially, the relationship appeared to be going well. 26-year-old Dillon was caring, attentive, and considerate, and friends said Alice seemed besotted. He and Alice spent a couple of weeks together in Newcastle and then in Edinburgh before he returned to Afghanistan for his final 2-month tour of duty. Dillon returned to the UK in April, and in July, Alice invited him on the family's annual holiday, where the pair were inseparable. However, this would not last, and it wasn't long before the cracks began appearing in the couple's short relationship. People in Alice's life started to notice some concerning changes in her. Once outgoing and someone that loved any chance to socialize, Alice was becoming distant and withdrawn. Dillon was becoming more and more critical of her in every way, so much so that it drove Alice further into an isolated state. She began losing a lot of weight and started falling out with friends she was once so close to. After a fight with her housemates, she moved out and into the ground floor flat on Rawling Road in Gateshead, where she lived with one of her work friends, Maxine. Women started contacting Alice, saying they had also been seeing Dillon at the same time she was. Following these claims, she ended the relationship for good in August. But Dillon was not prepared to accept no for an answer, and Alice's mental and physical health began to deteriorate even more over the following months. He bombarded her with calls, texts, and emails. While some messages were apologetic and begging for her to give him another chance, he started contacting her family and friends, even texting Sue, referring to her as Mom, and begging her to convince Alice to take him back. He then went on to tell her what a horrible person her daughter was. He was completely obsessed and would stop at nothing to get Alice's attention. Alice initially tried to be sympathetic and kind, feeling bad that he was so affected by the end of the relationship, but she soon was left with no choice but to cut him off as the tirade of messages and calls proved too much. He hacked into her social media accounts and threatened to release photos he had secretly taken of her. At the beginning of September, he gained access to Alice's Facebook account and found out that she had started a new relationship with an army officer called Mike. Dillon was completely enraged and contacted Mike, lying and telling him that Alice was still seeing him at the same time. On September 30th, Dillon drove to Alice's flat, repeatedly ringing the doorbell and then hiding when she looked outside. She knew in her gut it was him and didn't open the door. A few hours later, Dillon climbed the fence into the back garden and knocked on Alice's window as she was in her bedroom. When she opened the curtains, she saw flowers and chocolates on the windowsill and Dillon slowly backing away with his arms in the air. As he drove back to Edinburgh, he left a sinister voicemail on her phone that said in part, "I just wanted to give you flowers and chocolates to prove that no, I don't want to kill you. I'm not intending to kill you. That's all I wanted to say." Desperate for help and with the situation getting worse, Alice contacted the non-emergency police number 101 for advice. They logged the incident as harassment and issued a police information notice, also known as a PIN. A PIN is issued as a caution where there are allegations of harassment made, but it is not a court order, nor does it give you a criminal record, and signing it does not admit to any wrongdoing on the perpetrator's part. On October 3rd, this warning was communicated to Dillon in his barracks. It was arranged for his major at the Edinburgh barracks to issue the police information notice. although national guidance stated this should be done by a police officer in person unless exceptional circumstances prevented them. Despite the pin being issued, he sent Alice a parcel containing a letter and some other items. In the letter, he told her he knew she'd called the police, and he was now in a lot of trouble for it. He told her they had taken his laptop and phone away from him, but this was another lie. In the letter, he also said, "I'm in a lot of shit now, but hope you feel happy now. I'm sending you everything I have that reminds me of you as you belong to another man. Wishing you two a happy life. I will never come in your life again." Alice contacted the police for a second time. She told people she felt palmed off at the response from the police and was distraught and defeated, feeling nothing could or would be done to stop Dylan. She chillingly said to her sister, Emma, she felt the police would only respond when he stabs me. The 24-year-old was living in a state of fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. She asked to be driven home to her front door each day by a colleague, and once inside, she would immediately double lock it. During the evening of October 10th, Dylan drove down to her flat again. He climbed into the back garden and took a photo of the back window and bathroom before driving back to Edinburgh. Alice's day at work finished as normal. Her supervisor, Paul, gave her a lift home, dropping her straight at her door at 5:30 p.m. She messaged some friends showing them an outfit she had bought and briefly chatted to her boyfriend, Mike. The messages then abruptly stopped. Alice's flatmate Maxine returned home just before 6:30. Alice Ruggles was pronounced dead at 7:30 p.m. Her throat had been slit at least 6 times, and she had suffered 24 injuries in total. The coroner concluded that Alice had died from catastrophic blood loss. The police quickly identified Dylan as their only suspect. Officers started running his car number plate through the automated number plate recognition system. They quickly got a hit when his car was clearly picked up traveling from Edinburgh down to Newcastle earlier that day. Just before midnight, Dylan was arrested in his barracks on suspicion of murder. At 3:24 a.m., Dylan arrived at Gateshead Police Station for questioning. During an interview, he admitted he had traveled to Newcastle that day, but said it was because he wanted answers and closure about why the relationship had ended. He denied entering her flat, claiming that Alice was the one that came out and approached him. He told officers that she said she had heard stories about men killing their girlfriends, and she was scared he would do the same to her. Dylan said he reached out to hold her hands, and she scratched him across the face. After this, he drove away, he said. But what had actually happened was Dylan drove down and parked near Alice's flat, waiting for her to return from work. While waiting, he started messaging a girl on Tinder, making plans to meet up later that night. Around 6 p.m., he climbed over the back wall and forced his way in through the window. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and cornered Alice as she went into the bathroom. He knelt on her back to pin her down and slit her throat, cutting through to her spine. While Dylan was in custody, police discovered Alice's blood on his steering wheel and on his Help for Heroes wristband. Analysis of her phone records placed the phone en route to Edinburgh too. A few hours later, Dylan was charged with the murder of Alice Ruggles. His trial began in April 2, 2017 at Newcastle Crown Court, and he was still pleading not guilty to murder. But the overwhelming amount of evidence meant he and his defense team had no choice but to change his story. Dylan claimed that he showed up at Alice's flat with the intention of getting his belongings when a violent argument ensued. Alice attacked him with a knife, and in the process of trying to hurt him, she had inflicted the injuries upon herself. He then said that as Alice lay dying, she spoke of how much she hated her family. Dylan was asked what was going through his head as he looked down at Alice, and his response was that he felt terrible for her father Clive as he had been unable to protect his daughter in her last moments. The court also heard that a restraining order had been taken out against Dylan by an ex-girlfriend 3 years earlier. After his ex had broken up with him, he tracked her down and spat in her face in the streets while hurling abuse at her and her new boyfriend. Sadly, at the time of Alice's phone calls, Northumbria police had no knowledge about the earlier restraining order. After an 11-day trial and just 2 hours of deliberations, Dylan was found guilty of the murder of Alice Ruggles and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Carrying the knife to the flat would have given a 25-year starting point for Dylan to serve in prison, but as he didn't arrive armed with the weapon and to pick it up while he was in the flat, he was sentenced to a 22-year minimum term instead. During his sentencing, Judge Paul Sloan described the murder as utter barbarism and said, "Not a shred of remorse you have shown from first to last. Indeed, you were only concentrating so hard on getting your story right when giving evidence you forgot to even shed a crocodile tear." The police's handling of the case received huge backlash. After the trial, Northumbria Police conducted an internal review and identified potential misconduct by officers, which was referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. 2 officers then faced disciplinary action over the handling of the case. Northumbria Police said they did refer their actions to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, but said no one at the time knew the true threat that Dylan posed. The force have since apologized after the Independent Police Complaints Commission ruled that the officers failed to properly investigate Alice's claims. Gateshead Community Safety Board also carried out a domestic homicide review. The review concluded that Alice had been subject to significant stalking and agreed upon a series of 20 recommendations to help prevent similar incidents from happening again. Her parents, Sue and Clive, said, "We believe that her death was preventable. We find it difficult to comprehend that although Alice described in her first phone call to the police that she was being stalked and provided ample evidence, the police and the army were unable to support and protect her." Sue and Clive set up the Alice Ruggles Trust, which raises awareness about stalking and coercive control. They work to ensure that stalking offenses result in immediate action, both to protect the victim and to deal effectively with the alleged stalker. The trust also aims to provide education and training and campaigns for improved legal measures. They also launched the Alice Ruggles Trust Relationship Safety Resource, which is teaching materials and lesson plans that focus on stalking and coercive control. These are freely available to secondary school teachers throughout the UK. In 2020, stalking protection orders were announced by the government. This means that suspected stalkers could be given court orders blocking them from contacting or approaching their alleged victims while the police investigate the claims thoroughly. Sue said that new figures show an increase in the number of stalking incidents that were now being recorded by police, and she said this showed that officers were now correctly identifying the crime. Alice Ruggles' spirited, fun, and affectionate personality continues to live on through those that knew her. She made a huge impact in a short space of time. Her family and friends vow to keep her memory alive and hope that her story will continue to help and educate by supporting those that may have experienced similar things and by challenging the law and the handling of similar cases. Most importantly, they vow that Alice's name will not be forgotten and her voice will continue to be heard. 21-year-old Alyssa McLemore lived in Kent, Washington. According to her family, she was funny and vivacious, but her personality was most defined by her caring nature. She was a loving mother of a 3-year-old daughter. Alyssa and her daughter lived with Alyssa's mother so that Alyssa could help take care of her because she was severely ill with an autoimmune disease. On April 9, 2009, Alyssa's grandmother, Barbara, called her and told her she needed to return home because her mother's health was rapidly deteriorating. Alyssa said she would be getting on a bus right away. She was only about 6 miles away from home at that time, so her grandmother became worried when more than an hour went by and Alyssa still had not arrived home. A few hours later, the Kent Police Department came to Alyssa's family home to see if she were there. A 911 call had come in. The caller screamed for help and then the call abruptly cut off. The call had come from Alyssa's cell phone. Alyssa's family told the police that Alyssa had failed to make it home and asked them for help, but they were told that Alyssa had not committed any crime and that she was allowed to come and go as she pleased because she was an adult. It would be 4 days before the family could file a missing persons report and the investigation into Alyssa's disappearance began. The day before that report was finally taken, Alyssa's mother, Gracie, passed away at the age of 35, unable to see her daughter in her final days and say goodbye. Alyssa's mother's family belonged to the Aleut tribe, and the women in her family were subject to many of the struggles that plagued Native communities. Her mother, Gracie, and Aunt Tina grew up surrounded by substance abuse and violence. Gracie became pregnant with Alyssa when she was just 14, and Tina, who was just 2 years older than her sister, became pregnant. Gracie was eventually able to complete her GED and attend community college. She suffered from scleroderma, and her condition eventually worsened to the point that she was unable to work. Alyssa also faced difficulties of her own, struggling to support her beloved daughter. She was arrested 4 times for prostitution-related offenses between September of 2008 and February of 2009, a fact which her family believes impacted the investigation into her disappearance. I just kind of feel like they wrote her off as a prostitute, and they probably thought that, she didn't have family. Her Aunt Tina told CNN in 2019. There were a few other issues with the early investigation. DNA samples from Alyssa's family were not uploaded to the National Missing and Person System for potential future comparison for 2 years, despite the fact that Washington state law dictates that this be done after a person is missing for 30 days and in cases where criminal activity is suspected. Alyssa, who is of Alaska Native and African American descent, was also misidentified as Asian in her police report and therefore in the FBI's National Crime Information Center database. The error would not be fixed for 7 years. Because Alyssa's cell phone was not equipped with GPS, police were only able to narrow down the location where she made her 911 call to within a 2-mile radius of the cell tower it pinged off of. In 2019, the recording of the 10-second-long call was sent to the FBI and 2 independent analysts in hopes of identifying other voices or sounds in the background. A witness came forward after Alyssa went missing, claiming to have seen her getting into a 1990s model green truck, but it has not been confirmed if this sighting occurred on the day Alyssa disappeared. Alyssa's family worked tirelessly on her case, led by her Aunt Tina Russell. They have distributed flyers, organized searches, and held events to keep the public from forgetting about Alyssa and to ask for witnesses to finally come forward. Anytime Tina hears of remains being found in Washington state or in Oregon, she gets in contact with the local medical examiner to see if they could be Alyssa's. The family often felt alone in their efforts as the years went on without answers. But that changed in January of 2018 when Tina Russell received a message on social media from an activist working for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Indigenous women and girls are subjected to violence, go missing, and are murdered at rates much higher than the women in other demographics. These crimes largely go unreported, meaning that the true extent of the problem is much worse. For years, activists have worked to bring attention to one day eradicate crimes against these women as well as support the families of the missing and murdered. Tina Russell says that the movement and the help it has given her family has renewed her hope in finding out what happened to Alyssa. Over the years, Alyssa's family has looked into renting billboards to display Alyssa's picture and ask for tips in the case, but the cost involved was prohibitively high. Luckily, in 2019, Alyssa was selected to be part of the Washington State Police's Homeward Bound program. The program was started by Trooper Renee Paget in 2005 and partners with local trucking companies to display images of missing people and phone numbers to call with tips on the sides of semi-trailers, essentially making them mobile billboards as they travel through the region. The project has featured 28 missing people, 3 of whom have since been located. Camway Transportation, the Washington State Police's current partner in this effort, plans to put Alyssa on a total of 3 of their trailers. Even though a decade has passed since Alyssa vanished, her family is still hopeful that one day their advocacy for her will result in the answers that will offer them some measure of closure. Terrence Woods Jr. grew up in Capitol Heights, Maryland, and was one of 4 children. After graduating from Flowers High School, he enrolled at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. He graduated from the university in 2013 and then moved to the United Kingdom to study at the American International University in London, where he earned a master's degree in international relations. Terrence's former professors described him as bright, driven, and passionate about journalism and visual storytelling. He traveled around the world working on programs, from documentaries to television shows such as The Voice UK. In 2018, the 26-year-old was working for Raw TV, a London-based production company. That fall, he traveled to Idaho to work as a production assistant on a documentary. He was set to be in Idaho until mid-November working on the project, but on the morning of October 5th, he sent his father, Terrence Sr., a text message saying that he would be coming home on October 10th. Terrence Sr. was surprised because his son had never come home early from a work assignment before, despite sometimes working in very remote areas with challenging conditions such as Alaska, where he had previously worked on the Discovery series Gold Rush, Whitewater. Terrence Jr. spent the rest of that day working with the other 11 members of the crew in the remote area surrounding the abandoned Penman gold mine in the Nez Perce National Forest in northern Idaho. Other members of the crew would later report that Terrence had been behaving that day and was unusually quiet. As they were preparing to end work for the day, Terrence abruptly dropped his two-way radio and ran to the edge of a nearby cliff. He suddenly disappeared from view, and the other members of the crew thought he must have fallen. However, when they looked down, Terrence was running down the steep hill below, already 15 feet away from them. Other members of the crew tried to run after Terrence, but he refused to stop, and they eventually lost sight of him in the densely wooded area. Authorities were notified of Terrence's disappearance at 6:41 p.m. that evening, but were unable to begin a search for him until morning. The Idaho County Sheriff's Office, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the U.S. Forest Service were all involved in the early search, but their efforts were hampered by ice and snow. Eventually, conditions improved enough that the Air Force could fly helicopters equipped with infrared over the area. The Sheriff's Department in neighboring Clearwater County sent search dogs to help look for Terrence, and several local search and rescue groups also aided in the effort. A week after Terrence disappeared, the search for him was scaled back. According to the Idaho County Sheriff's Office, this was because no leads were obtained from the previous 7 days of searching, and no signs of Mr. Woods had been located in the search area or the expanded search area. Terrence's parents, Valerie and Terrence Sr., flew to Idaho to help look for their son. While they have praised the efforts of most of the law enforcement officers involved in their son's case and the local search and rescue groups who helped look for Terrence, they quickly took issue with Idaho County Sheriff Doug Giddings. When they met with him, Valerie asked him what other options they had for the search. His response was, "What are you supposed to do for someone who does not want to be found?" Terrence and Valerie were upset by this because the sheriff had no way to prove that Terrence was trying to avoid being located. It was also suggested to Valerie and Terrence that their son ran off because he had some sort of panic attack. They do not believe that this is the case because Terrence had no history of any sort of mental illness. Terrence Sr. is highly skeptical of the account the other members of the film crew provided. He believes that his son saw or heard something he should not have during the shooting of the documentary. He also believes that his son was not found during the large-scale search because his son was no longer in the woods. Someone had taken him elsewhere. Sheriff Giddings maintains that there are no signs of foul play in the case. Despite the lack of progress in the case, the Woods family has vowed to not give up until they find answers about what happened to Terrence. Bernadette Cooper loved to travel. She was a native of Castleblaney, County Monaghan, but moved to London while she was in her early 20s. She married and had 2 sons, Paul and Desmond, but the marriage ended in divorce. She and her ex-husband shared custody of their children. By the late 1980s, Bernadette had remarried and had another son, Stephen. She and her husband Brian wanted to live abroad somewhere warm and sunny and, therefore, were living in Spain on the Costa del Sol. They ran a pub called Molly Malone's in Benalmádena. Bernadette's personality made her well-suited for the work. She was feisty and vivacious and liked by all those who met her because of her friendly demeanor. The bar was initially very successful, but when a recession hit the Spanish economy in the early 1990s, Bernadette and Brian struggled to keep it open, falling behind on their bills. While dealing with the financial stress, they were also dealing with a great deal of stress on their marriage. In 1991, Brian returned to their home in Surrey to begin divorce proceedings, leaving Stephen and Bernadette in Spain. Bernadette was determined to keep her bar open. However, despite her best efforts, by late 1992, unable to pay her rent, she had to temporarily close Molly Malone's. She and Stephen returned to London so that Bernadette could finalize her divorce and try to raise the funds to save the bar. Bernadette tried to raise money from her family members and friends, but none of them were in a position to help her. Somehow, though, by January of 1993, she had apparently managed to acquire what she needed to reopen the bar. That month, she called a friend back in Spain from a phone at the Horse and Groom Public House on Mitcham Lane in London. She asked the friend to go to her lawyer and tell him not to give up the lease on the bar because she was on her way back to town with the money needed to reopen it. This phone call would be the last known time anyone saw or heard from Bernadette. Her friend did as Bernadette asked and went to see the lawyer, who was pleased that he would not have to sell the lease on the bar. The bar remained closed, waiting for Bernadette's return for the rest of the winter. But when she failed to return to Ben Al Medina, the lawyer did have to sell the lease. The new occupants of the building found all of Bernadette's belongings still packed up in the building's attic. Bernadette's family was not immediately concerned about her. They, like her husband, assumed she had returned to Spain alone to save the bar. They thought perhaps she wasn't in contact with them because her feelings were hurt when they couldn't help her with her financial problems. However, the unreturned phone calls eventually became concerning, and a visit to Spain revealed that Bernadette had never arrived back there. The family then began actively looking for Bernadette, making frequent trips to Spain to distribute flyers and look for witnesses. They started a word-of-mouth campaign trying to find information about Bernadette and the Irish communities in London and in Spain. They hired a lawyer to investigate the disappearance in 1996. When that investigation found nothing, the Salvation Army was asked to look for her. When that effort was unsuccessful, the UK Missing Persons Unit was asked for help. But again, they could not find Bernadette. It would later be discovered that the efforts had only searched for her using her given first name, Susan, and not her middle name, Bernadette, which was the name she actually went by. Bernadette's family spent the following decades traveling to Spain regularly and following up any lead they could find, but Bernadette remained missing. On his deathbed, Bernadette's brother Jim told his son, Leon Moore, how troubled he was by the fact that he was never able to find his sister. Before Jim died, Leon promised him that he would find Bernadette. Leon, along with Bernadette's sons and sister, has made great progress in his aunt's case. In 2020, leading up to what would be Bernadette's 77th birthday on June 20th, Leon was able to get Bernadette's story reported on in media outlets in the UK, Ireland, and Spain, renewing public interest in the case. The Surrey Constabulary opened a formal inquiry into Bernadette's disappearance with plans to try to coordinate with authorities in Ireland and Spain on the investigation. While Bernadette has been gone for 27 years, the passage of time has not diminished the pain her family feels or their hope to one day find out what became of her. She was a wonderful woman, my favorite aunt, a really great person, kind-hearted and strong-willed. That's why her disappearance is so out of character, Leon said of his aunt in 2020. It's very hard to not have closure or any information for so long about Bernadette's disappearance. It's heartbreaking. There are lots of gray areas in this. We just want answers. 25-year-old Lee Harvey worked as a bus driver, and his mom Maureen said all he wanted in life was to be a husband and a good father. His parents described him as cheeky and funny, always bringing so much good energy to everything. Lee had a young daughter, Danielle, whom he doted on, and Maureen said they were like two peas in a pod. He was separated from Danielle's mother, but the pair remained friendly and supportive of each other in raising their daughter together. 27-year-old Tracy Andrews had dreams of becoming a model and was working as a bartender when she met Lee in a club in 1994. Tracy also had a daughter 1 year apart in age from Lee's. She gave birth to her baby girl, Carla, when she was 21, but the relationship with her then partner was tumultuous. And less than a year later, the relationship ended. As soon as she and Lee met, the couple's connection was instant. They had a passionate and fast-moving relationship, and friends and family said they were inseparable from the get-go. It was said that Tracy was always incredibly possessive over her partners, and the relationships were always volatile. Lee was also a jealous person, and fights would often break out between the pair over the attention the other might get. Ex-partners said that Tracy had a vicious temper, often getting violent with them. Arguments between her and Lee would escalate and get out of control quickly, and violent outbursts would often ensue. Despite this, Lee moved into Tracy's flat after just 3 months, but he would often return to his parents' house as Tracy would frequently kick him out, throwing his belongings into bin bags. Despite everyone around the pair seeing how toxic the relationship was, Lee would always move back in, and the pair would try and work things out. Lee's mom, Maureen, said that everyone felt the relationship was bad news from the beginning. She said she could tell straight away that Tracy was controlling, paranoid, and extremely insecure. Tracy revealed to Maureen that she had had a difficult childhood and had never recovered from her dad walking out of the family home when she was 6 years old. The more time that passed, the more the relationship continued to grow toxic, dangerously unhealthy, and codependent. Maureen said the arguments became the only predictable thing about the pair. Neighbors would often hear the couple shouting at each other for hours at a time, and police were called on numerous occasions to the flat to break up the fights. Maureen was starting to notice some changes in her son that she didn't like. After finding out that Tracy had bitten Lee on the neck during a vicious fight, she called Tracy, telling her the relationship couldn't continue and that it was unhealthy for the pair to carry on seeing each other. But hers and everyone else's words fell on deaf ears and the couple carried on. Tracy soon fell pregnant, and although a shock, everyone hoped this might help the couple stop fighting and focus on what was now the most important thing. Lee was over the moon after 6 months, and much to everyone's concern, Lee proposed to after 6 months, and much to everyone's concern, Lee proposed to Tracy, and the pair set about planning their wedding. After another day of explosive rows, Tracy and Lee went to the Marlborough pub in an attempt to calm things down and patch things up. They left late into the evening and began the short drive back to the flat they shared in the Beck's ALV church in Worcestershire. A car pulled up outside the Hervey house. As Lee would often return to his parents' home during fights with Tracy, Maureen didn't think too much of it, listening out for him to walk through the door and explain what had happened this time. But Lee wasn't there, and his parents instead opened the curtains to see police officers walking up the driveway. The police explained that Lee and Tracy had been involved in a serious road rage attack as they were driving home from the pub, and tragically, Lee hadn't survived. He had been stabbed over 40 times, and a pathologist later described the attack as frenzied. Lee's fiancée, Tracy, had survived, and she was at the Royal Alexandra Hospital being treated for her injuries. A man staying in one of the cottages alongside the road the attack happened on had come out of the house that night and found Tracy standing by Lee's car, while Lee lay motionless in the road, covered in blood. The neighbors helped Tracy phone the police, and officers quickly arrived on scene. But by the time the police got there, Lee was already dead. Tracy told police that she and Lee had left the pub in Lee's car just before 10 p.m. Shortly into the journey, Lee overtook a dark-colored Ford Sierra. This had started what Tracy called a cat and mouse chase. The car began tailgating them, flashing the lights, and both cars began driving at high speeds down the narrow lane. Tracy said that she had shouted at Lee to slow down and ignore the car, but he didn't listen. The Ford Sierra eventually overtook them, and Lee got out before an altercation took place between the driver and Lee. The passenger in the other car also exited the vehicle, and a physical fight broke out. Lee and Tracy were both hit, and Tracy was knocked to the floor. When she got up, she realized Lee had been stabbed during the fight. The people in the other car fled the scene, and Tracy cradled Lee, with him dying in her arms. Lee's parents, Maureen and Ray, straight away had some questions. Why on earth would someone stab their son to death, believe his fiancée alive, seemingly unharmed, and now a key witness in the case? Why didn't she phone us? Ray asked. Maureen and Ray were distraught, but they needed Tracy to talk to them about what had happened that night. They both continuously tried and failed to get hold of Tracy after she was discharged from hospital. They finally got through to Tracy's stepfather, who said she hadn't rung them from the hospital as she'd forgotten their number, something that Ray and Maureen found impossible to believe given the amount of time she had called their home looking for Lee after a fight. Tracy's avoidance of Lee's family was concerning, and her story and reaction to the event after the fact was raising even more questions than answers. The strange and seemingly far-fetched reason behind her not talking to them after Lee was killed. She was still determined to believe in Tracy's story and support her. She said, "The police had told us she'd been attacked as well, so how could she have been involved? She might have been the last woman in the world I'd wanted Lee to end up with, but for all her faults, I was convinced she loved him." With uncertainty and doubt about what had happened that night and with rumors still swirling, on December 3rd, Tracy took part in a press appeal, and the police asked the public for something, anything that might help them catch the two men in question. As she held Maureen's hand, she recounted her version of events, giving descriptions of the men and talking about the same cat and mouse story that had led to the attack. Tracy then said that she urged the driver of the car to come forward, saying he was not in trouble and had done nothing wrong. The media had already been given one version of events by the police, but Tracy suddenly gave a totally different set of times. At this point, detectives stepped in to stop Tracy from talking, and the press conference was abruptly brought to an end. Tracy's appeal raised eyebrows with the media, and people wondered why she was not holding the driver responsible when the driver had, according to Tracy, been the one to initiate the fight. Police were shocked, as this was not anything they had agreed upon. They were definitely looking for the driver, as he was an accessory to murder, possibly even a co-conspirator in the case. As the room started to empty, chatter amongst the reporters began. Tracy's imitation of what she called the starry-eyed attacker was enough to convince many people that she was capable of that kind of rage and anger she described the attackers as having. One reporter in particular made a bold claim and outright said he believed they had all just in fact interviewed the real killer. Although it was a devastating thought, Lee's family were questioning Tracy even more. Her story just didn't make any sense, and more holes were starting to appear in it. Fortunately, the press conference did generate something for the police. Two witnesses came forward and said they had seen Lee's white Ford Escort that night, and he was driving past them on a junction about to turn onto the lane he was killed on. But out of nowhere, Lee's car suddenly braked and stopped in the road. The witnesses said no other cars were following them, and there seemed to be no reason for the car braking. And with this, they carried on driving. A day after the press appeal, Tracy attempted suicide by taking an overdose of around 200 pills. She left notes saying she couldn't carry on without Lee. She was taken to hospital where her stomach was pumped, and she spent the following 2 days recovering. Maureen and Ray visited Tracy in hospital, and while they were there, Tracy grabbed Maureen's hand and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I've done." After this, she went quiet and turned her head away, and Maureen and Ray left. Ray said to his wife, "That's the closest thing we're going to get to a confession." Tracy's story just wasn't adding up, and the police could find no evidence that a road rage incident had taken place at all. Investigators had thoroughly checked over the road the car chase and the attack allegedly happened on. It was a narrow single country lane, and if two cars had been speeding and overtaking each other, there would likely be tire marks or something that pointed towards a high-speed chase. But the road and grass along the side were completely clear. The location of the blood in the road in relation to where Tracy had said the attack had happened also didn't match up. And despite Tracy saying the attack had happened outside the vehicle, Lee's blood was found in the back seat of his car. No witnesses could attest to seeing the same dark car Tracy spoke about, and there was a substantial amount of time after Lee had been stabbed before Tracy raised the alarm. Nobody living near or driving along the road at the same time saw or heard anything apart from one person, a child living in one of the cottages near the lane. The 9-year-old said she had heard an argument that night but only remembered hearing 2 voices, not 4, and it sounded like the car was stationary and parked. Examination of Lee's body found almost 100 strands of Tracy's hair in his hand, which pathologists later determined had to have been taken from Tracy's head with considerable force, possibly during a physical fight. As well as wounds from a blade, some marks on Lee's body indicated that scissors may have been used. This pointed towards a Swiss Army knife being the murder weapon. Blood on her clothing showed a splash pattern rather than a transfer of blood from holding Lee as he lay dying, as Tracy had claimed. Testing was done on all of Tracy's clothing that she had been wearing that night, which confirmed there was a bloodstain on the inside of her boot. Forensic experts found the outline of the shape of a penknife imprinted on the inside of her boot. During her stay at the hospital, she visited the bathroom 6 times in 3 hours, and it was later revealed that she must have disposed of the knife somewhere in the toilets of the hospital. The same day Tracy was discharged following her overdose, police arrested her in connection with the murder of Lee, and on December 19th, she was formally charged. She vehemently denied any involvement and adamantly stuck to her story. To everyone's surprise, including the police, the judge made a decision that no one was expecting. Tracy was granted bail while she was awaiting trial and moved in with her mother and stepfather. It was another blow for Lee's family, and it was a highly unusual and controversial decision. Bail on a murder charge is not granted unless the court is absolutely satisfied that there is no significant risk that the person would commit an offense that would likely cause physical or mental injury to another person. In February 1997, Lee was finally laid to rest, with 100 turning out to pay their respects and show their love and support for the Harvey family. In July that year, 7 months after Lee's murder, Tracy's trial began at Birmingham Crown Court. While on the stand, Tracy's defense team asked her about her relationship with Lee, as well as her version of events. Tracy stuck to her story and maintained that although the couple fought a lot, she would never go as far as to kill him. She said they broke up all the time, but they truly loved each other and always came back together stronger than before. But a particular revelation Tracy used to highlight an example of this left Lee's family shocked. Tracy revealed that the miscarriage she had told everyone she'd had was actually an abortion that she had got after another fight with Lee. Maureen was devastated and called Tracy a lying bitch, to which Tracy angrily responded by shouting, pointing, and demanding Maureen be removed from the courtroom. The judge let Maureen stay, but this outburst gave the prosecution the perfect lead into their cross-examination of Tracy. After a few short weeks on trial, Tracy Andrews was guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years to serve. The judge said, "Only you know precisely what went on that night, but we have all seen the awful consequences." A year into her sentence, she filed an appeal claiming she was the victim of a miscarriage of justice because of damaging publicity surrounding her case. This appeal was denied. A year after this, in 1999, Tracy wrote a letter to her lawyer, finally admitting she did stab Lee to death, but maintained that it was self-defense. She said it happened in slow motion after a fight between the pair had escalated, and Lee pulled a knife on her. They struggled for a while and she said had lost control and stabbed him. She claimed she felt sick and ashamed and hated herself for doing that to Lee and his family. The self-defense claim was disputed by many, as most of the stab wounds were to Lee's back, and people suspected this came when he was trying to retreat and escape to his car to get away from the attack. A woman that Tracy had had a relationship with while in prison said that Tracy had attacked and strangled her for talking to an ex-girlfriend. She said she was opposed to Tracy ever being released and believed she would kill again if she was let out. Tracy Andrews served the recommended time of 14 years before being released from prison in 2011. She was ordered not to go within 25 miles of Lee's family. Tracy has since married, had reconstructive surgery to alter her appearance, and changed her name multiple times. For Lee's family and friends, the pain of knowing that Tracy is out of prison weighs heavily on them. Maureen wrote a book about the case and hers and her family's experiences. She said whenever she looks over old newspaper articles or letters from the case, it feels as if she is looking at someone else's family. Lee Harvey was charming and funny, honest and caring, and his parents often expect him to come walking through the door to see them. His family cherished the good memories and will always remember Lee for the great son and father he was. Angie Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Washington State. She was the youngest of her parents' 4 children, and their only daughter. She loved Christmas because it was just a few days after her birthday, and every year, both the holiday and her birthday would be celebrated with a large family party. The family moved to San Diego before finally settling in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Angie had a love for the outdoors, and going camping with her family was one of her favorite things to do. Angie excelled academically and was a tutor in math and English while she was a student at Idaho Falls High School. She graduated from the school in 1995 and briefly attended Idaho State University. While Angie was very close with her family, like many young adults, she struggled with balancing her love for them with her growing need for independence. In May of 1996, the 18-year-old decided to move out of her family home after a disagreement over her breaking a house rule. Angie worked at a local beauty supply store, and her income allowed her to rent an apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted house in the 400 block of I Street in Idaho Falls. At 9:15 p.m. on June 12, 1996, 3 weeks after she moved out, Angie came back home to see her mother, Carol. They sat on the couch and talked about how excited Angie was about being on her own, but also how difficult it was to be growing up. Angie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and Carol told her that she would always be her baby. Angie left around 10:20. Carol watched her leave, and as Angie drove away, she and Carol blew kisses to each other and mouthed, "I love you." This would be the last time Carol saw her daughter. The following morning, June 13th, Angie failed to show up to work, which was highly unusual. Her coworkers were worried about her, and one of them went to her apartment to check on her. They arrived just after 11 a.m. and entered Angie's apartment through its unlocked front door. They found Angie's body on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat had been slashed, and semen and foreign hairs were found on her body. DNA testing showed that they came from the same individual. While the DNA evidence could be used to prove a suspect's involvement in the crime, the Idaho Falls police first needed a suspect to compare it to, and for several months, they could not identify a promising one. Then, in January of 1997, an acquaintance of Angie's named Brian Hobbs was charged with raping a woman at knife point in Nevada. Because of his connection to Angie and the details of this crime, police in Idaho Falls began looking at Brian Hobbs as a potential suspect while he was still in custody in Nevada. As part of their investigation, they began questioning numerous friends and associates of Dobbs in Idaho. One of these individuals was a man named Christopher Tapp. Chris Tapp was 20 years old and a high school dropout. When he came in to speak to police and provide a DNA sample, he denied having any knowledge of the crime or playing any part in it. However, after being polygraphed 7 times and interrogated 9 times for a total of 28 hours over the course of 23 days, Christopher confessed to being involved in Angie's murder. He was charged in the case in February of 1997. Despite his confession, Christopher Tapp pled not guilty to Angie's rape and murder, and his trial began on May 2, 1998. His DNA did not match that found at the crime scene, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. A witness, Destiny Osborne, testified at the trial that she had heard Tapp and Brian Hobbs discussing Angie's murder at a party several days after it occurred, while she was high on methamphetamine. The prosecution's main evidence against Tapp was his confession. On May 28, 1998, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Tapp guilty of first-degree murder and rape. Because he had confessed and would not have been convicted without that confession, the judge at his sentencing hearing sentenced Tapp to life in prison with a 30-year minimum term rather than imposing the death penalty, as Carol Dodge had requested. While there had been a conviction in Angie's case, it was still not completely solved. Because the DNA found on Angie's body did not belong to Christopher Tapp, prosecutors argued that at least one other person had been involved in Angie's rape and murder. Carol Dodge was determined to bring this other individual to justice. She did not believe Tapp's claims of his innocence and did everything she could to get him to reveal the identity of the person whose DNA was left at the crime scene. She visited him in prison and begged him to tell her daughter's last words and the identity of the other man involved. She was livid when he told her he did not know. Carol spent years focused on the task of getting justice for her daughter, reviewing documents, questioning Angie's neighbors, and investigating every detail of the case on her own. However, the specifics of that mission did eventually change slightly many years after Christopher Tapp's conviction. While she had originally been confident in Tapp's guilt on the crime, she changed her mind after finally gaining access to the recordings of his interviews and polygraphs. Tapp had originally vehemently denied knowing anything about the crime. He would eventually provide police with 6 different stories about what happened to Angie based on information they provided him. He did not understand that the police could lie to him, so when they told him they had absolute proof that Brian Hobbs was involved, which they did not, Tapp told them that Hobbs had confessed to him and asked him to be his alibi. After a series of immunity agreements began coming into play, under which Tapp would only have to plead guilty to aiding and abetting an aggravated battery, police got him to say that he had been at Andrew's apartment and witnessed the crime. Police ran into a problem, however, when the results from the DNA tests on Tapp and Hobbs came in. Neither man was a match to the DNA at the crime scene. They then suggested to Tapp that another one of his friends, Jeremy Sargis, had been involved in the crime. Tapp now said that he had witnessed Sargis and Hobbs commit the rape and murder. When Sargis' DNA was tested, it was also not a match to the crime scene DNA, and police were able to confirm his alibi for the night of Angie's murder. They then voided Tapp's immunity agreements. In Tapp's final story, the one presented at trial, he said he held Angie down by the Hobbs and another man he could not identify beyond the first name of Mike were the other participants. Hobbs was never charged in the case. The tapes of the interrogation show Tapp being intimidated and fed information, but it was really the tapes of the polygraph examinations that made Carol understand why Tapp would make a false confession. A polygraph expert would later say that the test was used as a psychological rubber hose against Tapp. Michael Heavey, a retired Superior Court judge from Washington State, who would eventually work on Tapp's case through the group Judges for Justice, argues that the detectives involved broke the rules that surround the administration of polygraph examinations, likely because they did not believe anyone would ever watch the tapes of the exams, as polygraph results are not admissible in court. Judge Heavey argues that rather than use the exams to determine Tapp's credibility, as they are intended, the authorities in this case use them to brainwash Christopher Tapp and trick him into providing false testimony. During one of his polygraph exams, Tapp is threatened with dying in the gas chamber. Threats are not to be used in these situations specifically because they can lead to false confessions. The administrators of the test also convinced Tapp that the machine was telling them that he was lying when he said he was not involved in the crime and that it was infallible. He must have suppressed the memory of the murder because the machine could read his subconscious, and it said that he was involved. Tapp at one point asks the administrator if he had committed the crime. Tapp was provided with details of the crime and suggested answers to the questions he was being asked. When Tapp finally said he had stabbed Angie during the polygraph, one of the police officers in the room came over and shook his hand. Tapp was told he had passed the test by providing this answer. But the report from this polygraph shows that he was actually being deceptive when he said he had stabbed Angie. Carol Dodge was convinced of Tapp's innocence and believed that the just thing to do would be release him from prison. The woman who had previously asked for Tapp to receive the death penalty now became one of his biggest advocates. She contacted Stephen Dreisen, a professor at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law and a leading expert in false confessions, asking for his help in Tapp's case. He was familiar with the case because he had been talking to Tapp's legal team for over a year, and he agreed to work on it pro bono after speaking with Carol. His 2014 report found that Tapp's confession had been coerced and was the product of deceit and pressure from the authorities, who had then provided Tapp with enough details about the crime and the crime scene to make the confession seem credible. Tapp's case received the attention of and help from several organizations over the years. In addition to Judges for Justice, the Idaho Innocence Project took on the case in 2007, and the Innocence Project of New York also did work on the case. This help was invaluable, because Tapp's legal battle to prove his innocence and overturn his conviction had not been going well. Following his 2001 appeal, the Idaho Court of Appeals had ruled that Tapp's Miranda rights had been violated during many of his interviews with police, but that these violations were harmless. His appeals and petitions for post-conviction relief, which his mother, Vera, had mortgaged her home and spent years working 2 jobs to pay the legal fees for, all failed. The videos of the interrogations and polygraphs, as well as new DNA evidence, gave Tapp new hope. In his final story to police, Tapp had said that he had held Angie down by the wrists during her attack. Angie's hands had been swabbed as a part of the initial investigation, but those samples were never tested, even after prosecutors went to court to argue that Tapp had touched her specifically on that part of her body. They were finally tested in 2016 and only found Angie's DNA and that of the person whose semen had been found on her, such as Angie's blanket and a blood-stained teddy bear, also failed to find Tapp's DNA. Destiny Osborne, who had testified against Tapp at his trial, also recanted her testimony in 2017. She claimed that, like Tapp's confession, her testimony had been coerced by police who threatened her with drug charges after her release from the Behavioral Health Center, where she had been held on an unrelated offense. "I was manipulated and coerced and fed a huge story and threatened 23 years ago by the many members of the Idaho Falls Police Department to falsely testify against Chris Tapp," Osborne told the Idaho Falls Post-Register in 2019. In the fall of 2016, Christopher Tapp's lawyers met with Bonneville County Prosecuting Attorney Daniel Clark. Rather than pursue Tapp's 2 pending appeals, Clark agreed to drop Tapp's brief conviction. The murder conviction would still stand, but Tapp would be allowed to leave prison, having served 20 years. Christopher Tapp was not quick to agree to these terms. He still maintained his innocence and did not want the murder conviction to stay on his record. However, in March of 2017, he agreed to the terms. "I took the lesser of two evils," he later told the Idaho Statesman. "I've been fighting this for 20 years. When you lose so many hearings and lose so many battles, you continue to lose faith in the justice system." Carol Dodge and her son Brent Dodge were present at and spoke during Tapp's release hearing. "Chris, the day we were here and chose your jury, the jury that convicted you, little did we know what we know now," Carol said. "For 13 years, I was really angry at you. And of course, you were angry at me. I had a hardened heart because for 13 years, they programmed my mind to believe you were part of my daughter's killing." While Brent and Carol did not believe Tapp was involved in Angie's murder, they were glad that a way to have him released had been found, even if he had not been fully exonerated. Although the agreement is not perfect, it does provide the catalyst by which healing can take place, Brent said to the court. "So, Your Honor, on behalf of our family and Angie, we absolutely recommend Chris be set free." "Absolutely." On March 22, 2017, Christopher Tapp left the Bonneville County Courthouse after the release hearing as a free man. That same day, he visited the grave of his father, who passed away while Chris was incarcerated for the first time. While prosecutor Daniel Clark accepted the deal that set Chris Tapp free, he did not necessarily accept the notion that Chris Tapp was innocent. In July of 2015, facing pressure from the various advocacy groups working on Tapp's case, he commissioned an independent investigation into it. The investigation came to an end in the fall of 2016, and Clark maintains that it did not uncover any new, credible, and material evidence that Tapp is innocent. In a formal statement released the same day Tapp was released from custody, Clark said, "To be clear, there is not sufficient evidence to prove Tapp is innocent, which is the proper legal question at this time." He would later describe the deal to the Idaho Statesman as a means to an end. While Carol Dodge's advocacy had helped secure Chris Tapp's freedom, her work was not yet finished. He had not yet been exonerated, and Angie's real killer had not been brought to justice. Carol focused on the main piece of evidence in the case, the DNA, believing it would be what would finally identify the man who had killed her daughter. Even before Chris Tapp was released from prison, the Idaho Falls Police had been looking into using new DNA techniques to identify the man whose semen and hair had been left on Angie's body. In 2014, they used a public genealogy database to attempt to identify the killer. They looked at a public genealogy database that had originally been developed by the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation but had since been acquired by Ancestry.com. After they were compelled to provide information to the police by a warrant, Ancestry.com implemented protections to ensure that they would not have to do so in the future. Authorities used Y chromosome analysis to search the database and look for a match to the DNA from the crime scene. They found a man in the database who was a close but not identical match to the DNA at the crime scene. That man was Michael Usry Sr., who had submitted his DNA to the database as part of a genealogy project at his local church. Since he was not a perfect match, authorities began looking at his male relatives. Usry had a son, Michael Jr., who was a filmmaker living in Louisiana. He had been 17 at the time of Angie's murder and had briefly visited Idaho in 1996. Police in Idaho Falls obtained a search warrant, compelling him to provide a DNA sample. Michael was also interviewed about the case and denied any involvement in it. His DNA was not a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and he was cleared. The effort had not solved the case. Carol Dodge, however, was not ready to give up on the idea of using DNA or genealogy databases to identify Angie's killer. In November of 2018, the crime scene DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. Genetic genealogist CC Moore originally did not believe that she and her team could be of service in the case. The DNA had degraded over the years and was just barely within the range of what Moore was willing to work with. However, Carol Dodge then called her and convinced her to take on Angie's case. Moore submitted the DNA profile to GeneMatch, which allowed her to compare its autosomal DNA to the samples in the database. The 2014 effort had only examined and compared DNA on the Y chromosome. When the team from Parabont submitted their findings to the Idaho Falls Police Department in early 2019, they had identified 6 potential suspects, who were distantly related to the Usry family police had looked at in 2014. DNA samples were surreptitiously collected from these men, and they were eliminated. Furthermore, analysis of their DNA found that they were not closely related to Angie's killer. Cece Moore realized that there must be an unidentified member of the family tree she was missing. She eventually turned her attention to a young woman who had married into the family at a young age. That marriage ended in divorce, and the woman later remarried. While she did not appear to have a child during her first marriage, she gave birth shortly after it ended, but the child grew up with his stepfather's surname, which was why he had not been identified as a member of the family originally. Moore and her team were able to locate the woman's mother's obituary with the help of a small local library, and it listed her daughter with her new last name and the names of her children. The new potential suspect was named Brian Drips, and there was a 53-year-old man with that name currently living in Caldwell, Idaho. Police from Idaho Falls traveled to Caldwell to surveil Drips and hopefully collect an item he discarded that would have his DNA on it. Drips was a smoker, and police were eventually able to collect a cigarette, but they saw him discard. When the DNA on that cigarette butt was analyzed, it was found to be a match to the DNA found on Angie Dodge's body. On May 15, 2019, Brian Drips was brought in for questioning. He originally denied any involvement in the case, but once he was informed that his DNA had been matched to the DNA found at the crime scene, he confessed to both the rape and murder. Drips had lived across the street from Angie and had been interviewed by police about her murder just days after her death as part of the neighborhood during his confession. He claimed that he had entered Angie's apartment with the intention of raping her, but had not planned on killing her. He also said that he had acted alone and did not know Christopher Tapp. Following his confession, Drips was arrested and charged with Angie's rape and murder. At the press conference announcing Drips' arrest, Idaho Falls Police Chief Bryce Johnson acknowledged the role that Carol Dodge played in keeping Angie's case alive. "Carol inspired us all to try harder and do better," he said. "Carol, for 23 years, every day, every second of every day, she's been looking out for her daughter. This case begins and ends with Carol." On July 11, 2019, prosecuting attorney Daniel Clark filed a motion requesting that the court vacate Christopher Tapp's murder conviction. There exists clear and convincing evidence that Tapp was convicted of a crime he did not commit. Clark wrote in the filing, "Therefore, the state moves that the court grant post-conviction relief, set aside the jury verdict and vacate the judgment of conviction, and dismiss the case." On July 17th, Chris Tapp was in court for a hearing in the matter. Judge Alan Stevens approved the motion and told Tapp, "As far as the court is concerned, you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20-plus years." With the use of genetic genealogy, Carol Dodge was in court to see his name finally be cleared. Chris was able to find work after his release from prison and was working at a plastic bag factory at the time of his exoneration. His opportunities had been limited due to the murder conviction on his record, but his exoneration eliminates that problem. He is relieved to have finally restored his family's good name for his mother. In December 2019, he filed suit against the Idaho Falls Police Department and several individual detectives and officers seeking damages for false imprisonment and arrest, malicious prosecution, defamation, libel, negligence, and emotional harm and distress. Brian Drips remains in custody awaiting his trial, which is currently set to begin on June 8, 2021. His lawyer is currently petitioning for his confession to be thrown out, and for a change of venue due to local media coverage of the case. Carol Dodge is frustrated by the long wait for the trial and worried she will be unable to make the frequent trips to another part of the state for the trial and other hearings related to the case. "Angie's case is just as well known over there as it is here," she pointed out. Despite the challenges she has faced and the twists and turns the case has taken over the past 2 decades, Carol remains just as committed as ever to making sure that justice is served in Angie's case. Mary Jamison was born on January 11, 1953, but she was affectionately called Bobo by everyone who knew her. One of 5 children, she was born and raised in Magnolia, a town in southwestern Arkansas, an area where her family had deep ties. Her father, Gresham, had grown up on a farm north of Magnolia, and her mother, Sue, was born in Sparkman, approximately 60 miles away. Both Gresham and Sue attended college in Magnolia, at what was at the time called Magnolia A&M, but would become Southern Arkansas University by the time Bobo graduated from the school in 1976. Gresham went into real estate development following his graduation, and in 1949, he and Sue founded their family business, Magnolia Lodging. The couple developed more than 50 properties together over the course of their career, mainly hotels and motels in Arkansas and Texas. Sue was also very active in civic and charitable endeavors in the community. She loved the arts, particularly theater, and served on the Magnolia Arts Council. Bobo was in certain ways a good mixture of both of her parents. She was active in her community from a young age as a Girl Scout. In 2014, one of her classmates would write to the local paper to share the story of how Bobo responded to the integration of Magnolia schools. The classmate, who was African American, recalled the uneasiness she felt coming into the previously all-white school, and how Bobo's acceptance of and friendliness towards her new classmates inspired other students to behave in the same manner, making what could have been a difficult transition much easier. Bobo loved the arts like her mother, but whereas Sue preferred the theater, Bobo had a passion for studio art. After graduating from college, she opened up a small art studio in Magnolia and began teaching art classes out of it. She also shared her father's interest in real estate and purchased a house on McNeil Street to refurbish and resell for profit. Rather than outsource most of the labor the home needed, Bobo did it herself. On the morning of July 20th, 1978, 25-year-old Bobo went for a walk and then into her studio, where she taught a morning art class. While the day started off normally, Bobo would not return home at her usual time. She still lived at her family home, and Mrs. Shin became worried when it was almost time for dinner, but Bobo had not made it back. She began calling around to Bobo's friends to see if they knew where she was. Bobo had taken an ad out in the local paper for the home she had renovated and was now trying to sell. Her friend Anita, whom she had met because she was dating a friend of Bobo's boyfriend, had called Bobo at her studio that morning. Anita was still a student at Southern Arkansas University and often spent time with Bobo in the afternoon. After she was done with her classes and Bobo had finished teaching her lessons, their favorite place to spend time that summer was the pool at the motel on Main Street Gresham Shin had recently built. When Anita called Bobo at 11 a.m. that day to ask her to get together that afternoon, Bobo could not immediately commit to any plans. She was waiting to hear back from a man who was interested in potentially buying the home she had just renovated. She promised to call Anita back after she found out if she would be showing him the house that afternoon or not. Bobo called Anita back just a few minutes after hanging up from that first phone call. The prospective buyer had just called her back, and he had a house just outside of Magnolia he was interested in trading her house for. She was going to meet with him, but hoped to be able to see Anita afterwards. "Come looking for me if I'm not back this afternoon," she joked before hanging up the phone. Mrs. Shin was also able to learn that the man her daughter was meeting was having his car serviced at the Pontiac dealership in town and had arranged for Bobo to pick him up at the Easy Mart across the street from it. No one seemed to know his name, however. Mrs. Shin decided to drive over to the dealership to see if they could provide her with any information about the man. She arrived at the dealership just as the employees were closing up for the day. They did not have any cars in for service that could have belonged to the still unidentified potential homebuyer. One of the dealership employees was able to tell Mrs. Shin that he had seen a car that looked like Bobo's blue 1976 Buick pick up a man in the Easy Mart parking lot around noon that day. After sharing that information with Bobo's mother, the dealership employee then left to go home. His involvement in the search for Bobo was not over yet, however. As he drove down Main Street, he happened to see a blue Buick parked behind Smitty's grocery store. He pulled into the parking lot to see if anyone was around the vehicle. No one was. However, the scene inside the car was concerning. Bobo's white tennis shoes were on the floor by the pedals, and her sunglasses and a novel were thrown on the passenger seat. Her purse, wallet, and the keys to the car were still inside of it. The only thing that will be found to be missing was Bobo's address book, which authorities would later speculate had been taken to prevent them from gathering any information about the man Bobo had her meeting with that day. The dealership employee immediately drove back to work to tell Mrs. Shin about what he had found, and she in turn notified the police. A massive search for Bobo was carried out, and her family quickly offered a reward in the case. Originally, it was $10,000, but eventually it grew to $25,000. Witnesses were able to help the police put together a timeline. Employees at Smitty's had noticed Bobo's car in the parking lot at 1:30 that afternoon. A witness at the Easy Mart had seen a dark-haired man come into the store to get change for the payphone around 11 a.m., just before Bobo received the call from the man who was interested in her investment property. After the story of Bobo's disappearance and photographs of her car appeared in the local paper, the county tax assessor, Henry Irwin, came forward with a potential sighting of the vehicle. Mr. Irwin had been mailing hay on his property on July 20th. Around noon, he saw a blue Buick traveling down the highway, weaving back and forth. It appeared to him that the man and woman inside the car were struggling as they drove. A carpenter had been working across the street from the house Bobo had been trying to sell. He came forward with a sighting of her on the day she disappeared, but this account has since been called into question. The carpenter said that he saw a woman he believed to be Bobo around 11:30 a.m. on the day Bobo went missing. Shortly after she arrived at the home, a man with brown hair and a mustache drove up in a dark green Pontiac. He and Bobo went inside the home and came back out after approximately 10 minutes. They then each got into their own cars and drove off in the same direction, with the man following Bobo. The problem with the sighting is that it does not line up with where Bobo was planning to meet the man who was interested in trading houses with her. It is possible that she ended up meeting with two men that day. The man the carpenter saw and the man seen getting changed for the payphone, who may or may not have been the man who spoke to Bobo on the phone in between her calls to Anita, were similar in appearance, but appeared to be two different individuals. The man the carpenter saw had facial hair, whereas the one seen at the Easy Mart did not. It is possible that Bobo received another phone call from a second man interested in her property after she hung up from her second phone call with Anita. However, the timeline would be very tight, especially given the fact that some reports say that Bobo went home to change clothes before going to meet with anyone about the property. It would only have taken about 5 minutes for her to drive from the Shin family home to the house on McNeil Street, but since she couldn't have left her studio before 11:15, it would have been difficult for her to meet someone at the investment property by 11:30. It is not impossible, however, and even with this potential second meeting, she would have had enough time to get to the Easy Mart to pick up the man as the dealership employee had witnessed. If Henry Irwin's timing is correct, and it was Bobo's car he saw swerving down the highway, then it appears this man attacked Bobo straight away, never going to the home on McNeil Street with her. Seeds and grasses had been found all along the bottom of Bobo's car, as though it had been driven through a field. Given the fact that Bobo's car had been seen driving at noon and was abandoned at the grocery store by 1:30, the car could not have been driven very far away in that limited amount of time, which in theory narrowed down the search area. Even if the car Henry Irwin had witnessed at noon was not actually Bobo's, the time frame is still not widened by very much, as Bobo was still at her art studio until after 11 that morning. Despite the extensive searches and manpower dedicated to the investigation, Bobo has never been found. The investigator most closely tied to the case is Mike Lowe. Lowe had been with the Arkansas State Police for just 10 months when Bobo went missing. While he was not immediately assigned to the case, he was immediately connected to it. His hometown was not far from Magnolia, and he was a graduate of Southern Arkansas University. While he was a student there, Bobo Shin had sat in front of him in one of his history classes. While he and Bobo were no more than casual acquaintances, he was still shocked to see her familiar face in the newspaper, alongside an article about her disappearance. The following May, Lowe was sent to Magnolia to serve as the lead investigator for the state police there, allowing him to work on his former classmate's case, which the other investigators in town were still working as thoroughly as they were when Bobo first went missing. The carpenter who had been working across McNeil Street from the home Bobo was trying to sell or trade had helped develop a composite sketch of the man he said he saw with Bobo the day she disappeared. A considerable amount of time and resources had been put into distributing the sketch and interviewing men who resembled it during the first several months of the investigation. However, by the time Mike Lowe joined the investigation, the investigators who had been working on it since July were beginning to believe that the composite sketch was actually of a man who lived several houses down from the home Bobo owned and was unrelated to the case. Mike Lowe shared their concerns. While law enforcement's desire to close the case never waned, they eventually began running out of new avenues of investigation. While the Shin family appreciated all of their work, eventually presenting Mike Lowe with a piece of Bobo's artwork in appreciation for all of his efforts, they were desperate to have all possible resources focused on finding Bobo, and so they also hired private investigators to work on the case as well. While authorities believed that it was most likely that Bobo had been killed by the man who called her about her investment property on the day she went missing. In October of 1979, her family was still hopeful that she was somehow still alive, even though more than a year had gone by without any sort of ransom demand. They had already gone through 2 private investigators, and that month they reached out to the third and most controversial investigator they would hire. William Deere was a Texas-based private investigator who had recently garnered national attention for finding James Dallas Egbert III and returning him to his family. Gresham Shin hoped that Deere could likewise help reunite his family with Bobo. While Deere did not believe that Bobo was still alive, he nevertheless took on the case. After arriving in Magnolia, Deere performed his own interviews and carried out his own searches. In part due to the composite sketch based on the carpenter's account, Deere eventually focused his investigation on a man from the next county over, Michael Morse. Morse had taken his own life several months after Bobo went missing. He resembled the sketch, and the carpenter claimed, based on a photo, that he was the man he had seen. Because of his resemblance to the sketch, Morse had been interviewed by the authorities within a week of Bobo going missing. When Deere interviewed Morse's boss, he said that he had taken July 20th, 1978 off to go meet with someone about real estate. Deere claimed that a psychic called him on the phone and told him that Morse had buried Bobo's body on top of his own father's coffin. On November 20th, 1979, Dewey Morse's grave in the Western Cemetery next to Missionary Baptist Church was exhumed, but no extra body was found in the grave. Despite this setback, Deere publicly announced that he would solve the case within the next 2 weeks. This, of course, did not go over well with the authorities who had been working on the case for over a year, who did not appreciate his arrogance. While the Morse family did consent to the exhumation of Dewey Morse's grave, they filed a $2 million lawsuit against William Deere. Less than a month after it occurred, Sam Tatum, who had been the head of the State Crime Commission at the time, was also initially named in the lawsuit, but was later dropped from it. Michael Morse's widow, Norma, and his mother, Corinne, sued for emotional distress and invasion of privacy. They claimed that Deere had engaged in extreme and outrageous conduct in publicly accusing Michael Morse of abducting and killing Bobo, using information received from a so-called psychic, and through other similarly bizarre sources. Deere would later say that the tip that led to him exhuming the grave had not actually come from a psychic. He had made up the story about a psychic calling him with the information in order to protect an informant. In June of 1981, a civil jury ruled in Deere's favor in the lawsuit. While Deere has long since been off of Bobo's case officially, when reporter Paul McDonald interviewed him in 2016, he said he was still investigating it on his own. He claimed that he had recently heard from a new informant who had passed a polygraph. He could not name the informant out of concerns for his safety because he was implicating someone who was still alive. The informant believed that Bobo was buried on a specific piece of property just outside of Magnolia. Deere says he emailed Mike Lowe with this information but was asked to relay it to the county prosecutor. Not trusting the prosecutor to follow up on the information, Deere decided to finance a search of the property himself. As of the publication of McDonald's article on Bobo's case in March of 2016, he was still working to secure the necessary permissions to do so, and it does not appear as though the search has since been carried out. In the decades following Bobo's disappearance, Mike Lowe has performed more searches and followed up on leads all over the state of Arkansas and the southern United States. The intensity of his focus on the case has not diminished despite the passage of time. He retired from the Arkansas State Police. He then ran for and was elected sheriff of Columbia County and continued his investigation into Bobo's disappearance in his new role. In January of 2015, Sheriff Lowe worked with a team of 3 other investigators to revamp the investigation. They looked at all of the evidence again and re-interviewed witnesses. The information was organized into a new file that Lowe submitted to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. He has also resubmitted evidence for more sophisticated testing than was available in 1978. So far, these efforts have not resolved the case. Both of Bobo's parents passed away without ever learning what happened to their daughter, her father in 1986 and her mother in 2012. In 2014, her brother and 3 sisters decided they wanted to celebrate Bobo's life, despite the lack of information about exactly how it ended. On July 19th, the family gathered in the Memorial Park Cemetery to dedicate a headstone for Bobo, next to the plot shared by her parents, where they hoped to one day lay her to rest. Later that day, the family and the community gathered for a memorial service for Bobo at Central Baptist Church in Magnolia. The service featured multiple musical performances, memories, and speeches, one of which was given by Dr. John Stubblefield, who had served as pastor of the church in 1978 and knew Bobo. For those who are perpetrators of evil, be sure that your sin will find you out. Not that God will find out about your sin, He knows it. But the sin will be exposed, he said at the service. It is my hope and prayer that someone even at this date might come forward and share something that would help bring closure to this family. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.